Hello and welcome to Climate Week 2020. Thank you for joining us as we kick off one of our first major panels for the week on all the issues that we need to address if we're going to get the world on track to address the climate crisis. I hope all of you are safe and well in the midst of the multiple crises going on. We have a great panel for you today. I'm Nat Cohan, the Senior Vice President for Climate at Environmental Defense Fund. And I just want to provide a couple of opening remarks before I turn it over to our terrific lineup of speakers. You know, I live in Manhattan, and normally this time of year, people and global diplomats and traffic is snarled at Midtown, and obviously things are much quieter this year. But the urgency of addressing the climate crisis remains the same. If you had any doubt, we've seen the wildfires raging in California in recent weeks. We've seen 2 massive tropical storms and hurricanes hitting the Gulf Coast. And of course, that's just in the US. We see extreme weather events mounting around the world and record temperatures continuing to climb, along with all of those impacts of climate change that we see today. You know, it was just 5 years ago that the world came together to agree the Paris Agreement, a major milestone in international cooperation. But 5 years on, it's also clear that we're not doing enough in terms of global ambition. In 2019, greenhouse gas emissions globally hit another record high. And while the COVID crisis and the economic recession that it's brought has caused a temporary downturn, the trend continues upward, and we need to do much more if we're going to turn the corner on global greenhouse gas emissions and put the world on a path to net zero emissions. That's the balance between what we put into the atmosphere and what we take out that climate scientists say is necessary to stabilize the climate and protect the planet. So with us today, we've got a great lineup. I just want to set the stage as well by noting that Climate Week this week kicks off what we think of as a critical 14-month period for climate action. Normally in the fall, we would have an international climate conference, but that's been pushed off to 2021. So we have a 14-month period between now and November 21, when COP26, the Conference of the Parties, the 26th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention, will meet in Glasgow in Scotland. That's a critical milestone for raising ambition. And between now and then, we see a couple of key things we need to do. Number one, very relevant to Climate Week, get the private sector engaged. We'll be talking much more about that in other events this week, going on throughout the week. I want to focus here on 2 additional pieces we will need. First is leadership, above all from the world's 3 largest emitters. China, the United States, and the European Union together account for about half of global greenhouse gas emissions. We'll need leadership from those big emitters if we're going to solve the climate crisis. The EU made a big announcement last week, I'm sure we'll hear about it, to really raise its ambition. China is also moving forward. The missing one right now, of course, is the US, but in the US at the state level, we see leadership from California and others. The other big thing we need to do is to rebuild better as we emerge from the COVID crisis. We need to integrate climate into economic stimulus and recovery, and that's what today's panel will focus on. So to lead the way and moderate the terrific lineup of speakers, let me turn it over to EDF Europe Executive Director, Jill Duggan. Jill, over to you.
Thank you, Nat, and I'm really pleased to be here. Like many people this year, I was both recruited and started a new job virtually, which says an awful lot about the way the world has changed in 2020, where not only have we been forced to change the way we live, but we've also been forced to reflect on the way we live. And I think although this has been a year of great tragedy, both in the COVID crisis and also, as Nat mentioned, in the dreadful fires and the climate events that we've seen around the world, this is also an opportunity where we bring those 2 together to see whether there is a silver lining here, whether in rethinking how we move forward from the natural hiatus that the COVID crisis has created, whether we can make a better world. Nat referred to the European Commission's proposed new limit on emissions for 2030. Back in 2014, a year prior to the Paris Agreement, Europe was out of the starting blocks first with a commitment to reduce emissions by 2030 on 1990 by 40% at least. They've now revised that target, or they proposed to revise that target, if we're absolutely accurate about that, to a reduction of 55%, a cut of 55% on 1990 by 2030. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers, but before we move to the panel, I wanted to hand over to our keynote today. The European Union, and there's a lot of terms that have Europe in front of them that become quite confusing because there's so many institutions, but the European Union of 27 states rotates the presidency of the Union amongst each member state for 6 months at a time. And in this crucial 6 months, Germany hold the presidency. And for that reason, I'm very, very pleased that our keynote speaker today is State Secretary Jochen Flassbart from the German Ministry of Environment, and who probably rarely actually has had a career in environment prior to his political career. So State Secretary, please, can you give us our opening remarks?
Thanks, Nat. Thanks, Jill. Colleagues and friends, really a pleasure to be with you here online on this webinar conference in the course of the Climate Week. I mean, we were suffering from the pandemic over the last months, but we also have learned a lot, at least me, and I think many others, how to communicate with a broad community, and that we really gained some advantages to connect each other much better than in the past, although we all have the desire to see some real persons at a certain point in time again. So let me share a few points on the very important topic, this conference here, Rebuild Better, making climate progress central for the post-COVID economies. I think the title is economy, but I turned it into the plural because I think this is essential for all economies around the world. So just let me share some thoughts. First, number one is we have seen how the virus led in a couple of weeks, in the course of a couple of weeks, to a more or less lockdown of our economies. The world economy was close to collapse. At least there is a huge damage in more or less all the regions of the world. And the essence of my first point is to turn out this was just one stressor. It is a virus, a very aggressive one, one which very fast travels around the world, but it is one stressor. If we now try to get some lessons learned of that, my key point is when we are not going to stop climate change, and in the sense Nat mentioned in his introductory words, we are going to have a multiple dimension disturbances around the globe, on the regional level, on the global level, on the local level, in different sectors. And there is no way thinking about that we, humanity, will be able to manage this. We have to stop it. Otherwise, it will not be manageable. And we have got a first taste now from the corona pandemic. So how to stop it? We have, luckily, the medicine. We have our Paris Agreement, and we have the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. If we take this serious, I'm sure we will be able to rebuild, exactly as the title of your conference is, in a better way. My second point is, during the next 2 years, we started already around the world, we will invest more money than ever in our economies. Some experts are talking about $11 trillion or even more that will be boosted into our economies. So we have basically two options. Either we go into the past, back into the past, we invest into the brown, into the climate unfriendly, in the unsustainable economies we were just on our way to leave, or we take this money and speed up what we need to do anyway, to get climate neutral in the course of this century. Here in Germany, we decided to be climate neutral by 2050, as the same as for the whole European Union. And there is a tremendous chance in this. In the bad, there is something good. We can use this huge amount of money. And actually, talking about our own country and about Europe, and Asa may follow up on that later on, I was not sure at the very beginning whether we have learned our lessons or not. I was not sure whether the very young baby European Green Deal would survive this crisis. And what we saw in the past could leave us with some doubts. Looking at the financial crisis 2009, 2010, I was advocating like hell. Nobody was even interested in this. They didn't understand. And now it's completely different. My view is that we strengthened the European Green Deal. Looking at the recovery money in investments in my country, it's mostly pumped into renewables, into decarbonizing the mobility sector, and decarbonizing the hardcore industry, so to say, chemicals, steel, copper, concrete, and all these sectors. And on the European level, we see the same. The 750 billion recovery money, already the title gives an indication. Next Generation EU. How marvelous this is that we are going to invest into the next generation. Of course, this has to be a sustainable one. My last point is EU, China, US. Of course, I mean, although I know you know it and you can't hear it any longer, but still I want to say how disappointed we were that the US administration decided to leave the Paris Agreement. This is something we will never accept. Of course, it's the right of the US to do so, but we are extremely disappointed, and we hope that also, as has been mentioned, on the state level, things will go in a different direction, and it does in some of the states, but we also hope that the US will rejoin the global family in fighting climate change. With China, Europe is in a very intensive dialogue. Germany is in the EU presidency at the moment. We do our best. And we do it in the sense that we want to mutually, as is in the Paris Agreement, mutually work on fighting climate change. And the first step has been done. The proposal by the Commission, at least 55% domestic, by the way, so Article 6 measures would come on top of that. It's not decided yet. We need to get the member states on track, and we as a presidency will work heavily on that, and this is our part from the EU. But of course, we do have also some expectation in China's action. We all are committed to come up with a new enhanced LEC. We hope China will do the same. We hope in getting an earlier peak in China, and I think it's doable. We also hope to get some idea how the target of climate neutrality will work out in China. And we all hope that nobody in the world will continue to invest in coal, in old fossils. This is not the future. The future is renewable. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, State Secretary. And I know that you have to leave us before the end of this session. And I'm just wondering if you feel, you mentioned that you were concerned at the start of the COVID crisis that Europe might not act together. Are there areas of Europe that have changed their attitude to climate change during the, or to the response to the Green Deal during the COVID crisis that you've seen?
Yes, why talking about others? I can talk about my own country. We have changed a lot. I mean, ministries for environment and climate around the world are mostly not those who are accompanied by many friends. So we experienced that in the past. A lot has changed. The attitude has changed. When I talk now with industry, it's so different from the past. In the past, usually the sentences were like follow. Yes, we are committed to fight climate change, but, and then something wrong came. But now there is a new credibility in what leaders in industry are saying. They know that they have to come up with green steel, for example. They know that the old world is over, and that is something which is really encouraging. And now politics has to deliver. We need to set the right frame. And I think same is happening in other countries. In Eastern Europe, many economies are much more dependent on coal than we are, for example. So they have to go a longer way, and they have to convince their societies. But I think we are getting on track now.
Well, that's a great optimistic start for this discussion. We have coming up now a fabulous panel from Europe, from China, from very progressive parts of the United States. I'm very pleased to see Mary Nichols here, and also talking about more broadly across what the rest of the world is doing as well, and what can be done there. So I'd like to hand over now to our first panelist, Arta Runge-Metzger, who's a Director of Climate Strategy at DG Climate Action in the European Commission and has held many senior roles on climate action in the European Commission. So Arta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jill, and thanks, Nat. I'm just expanding on what Jochen was just saying. We are both coming from Europe. From our end, and I will speak a little more about how we want to use the recovery money in the context of getting to climate neutrality by the year 2050, and also on the way to meet the new target that we are proposing, minus 55% by the year 2030. And I think the trick here is to marry two ideas with each other. One is the long term with the short term necessity, because what we see and what citizens in Europe are concerned about is, of course, how are we going to make a living next week, next month, next year. So the COVID recovery, where we want to spend from the European at the EU level side, 750 billion euros in the coming 2 years, needs to be spent in a way that it's going to give hope to those people who are looking for their jobs. So it must have an immediate impact on job creation or maintaining the jobs that are there. It needs to create demand again in many areas of the economy where demand has been going down. And then at the same time, we have to bounce not backwards, but we have to bounce forward into our economy to lay the seeds for the long-term sustainable growth that we are expecting. So how do we want to do this? And what are the big ideas there that we need to push? I think if we look forward, reaching 55% emissions reduction, one of the big areas Jochen has already mentioned is the energy sector. So to speed up in the transformation of the energy sector, it means investing massively into renewables. And this is not in Europe, and I think everywhere else in the world, an expensive business. It is something where you have companies that have been set up. They all have plans in their drawer in order to move forward. So it's really making those things happen. And that will affect many industries in Europe, because the windmill, if you build it, will require steel. So you also help the steel industry and the steel worker. If you move for solar panels, it's exactly the same. If you put them onto the houses, there need to be people who are going to do this. There's the whole manufacturing sector that you can help. And in the long term, you're going to help the homeowner to reduce the energy bill. And particularly on the renovation, this is an area where there's a lot of demand and still a lot of need and a huge potential to reduce emissions. And when we talk about renovation, it's really the deep renovation that is required. Often we see the kind of facelifting of houses, but that's not what we want. We want to really make sure that energy efficiency moves up, that the remaining energy that is required for the houses comes from renewables, and then also that we start managing our homes in a smart way. So connectivity, digitalization is something that will also come on top of that. And that will also help in this crisis, because I think we have been working from home. We are just called back to go to our home offices again, and for probably quite some time. So helping the digitalization is going to help in many different ways. And I think that's also true for our children and our kids. So that's the other big idea, is digitalization in Europe, rollout of broadband, not only in the cities, but also in the rural areas who are a little bit hanging behind. And then there's the big transformation in terms of mobility. And that's a topic Mary and myself are talking about regularly. How do we make this big revolution happening, which is on our doorsteps? We see it happening, but it will require public engagement, particularly when it comes to infrastructure recharging. And again, this is an area where you can create in the short term many jobs in Europe. And then you will create the conditions for the automotive industry to really sell the electric cars, the hydrogen cars to the people. And I think there is an increased interest we see when we look at the numbers in terms of the sales over the last months. So these are areas where we can marry the recovery with the Green Deal, meeting our long-term targets and our new 2030 target. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur. I've also been slightly nagged by my colleagues that I forgot to mention two things. Firstly, that we're recording this and we will send out to all who've registered a recording afterwards. And secondly, that if you have questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And if you've got technical difficulties, use the chat function. Going from Europe to China, there's been some very promising noises coming out of China recently about the words carbon neutrality in mid-century, and there's been, has been mentioned already, dialogue with the EU. I think many of us will want to know what China's doing now in the recovery to spend money in the right direction, and how can we rely on that? So Yongzhen, be really good to hear what you have to say. Yongzhen Zhang is a research fellow at the the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jill. Hello, everyone. It's my great honor to be part of this event. First, I would like to briefly introduce what I'm doing, and then specifically talk about the implications to green recovery in the wake of COVID-19. I do research on green transition and advise the government. A focus of my work is to show how carbon emissions reduction could become an opportunity rather than a burden. Conventionally, emissions reduction is seen as a burden, and the benefit of climate action is defined as the climate damage to be avoided in the future. We think this is not very correct. We show that carbon emissions reduction could drive the economy to a more competitive structure, so the benefit of climate action could be much higher than many people think. Climate action is not a burden, but an opportunity in general. In fact, the green economy is even cheaper than the existing non-green economy if you take into account its external cost, hidden cost, long-term cost, opportunity cost, and the well-being loss. However, to achieve the jump from the old economy to the new green economy, we need to solve a chicken and egg dilemma. This dilemma is green transition needs the government to take bold action, but the government is risk averse, and its decision needs to be evidence-based. No evidence, no action, no action, no evidence. This is a dilemma. How to solve this dilemma? We need new thinking and new vision. If leadership has vision and understand that green is the correct direction, then the government will take bold action and the vision would come true. Green transition is a self-fulfilling process. If you have confidence to it and work on it, more resources will be mobilized in the green direction in the market, and the green transition will really happen. But green transition is not just to produce the same in a green way. More fundamentally, we need green consumption. We need to change our lifestyle and value. We need to rethink what is good life. This comes to my second point, the implications to green recovery in the wake of COVID-19. I think the big lessons of COVID-19 are two. First, we need a paradigm shift of development. The existing growth model established after the Industrial Revolution is unsustainable and problematical. That model is based on consumerism and overconsumption of industrial products, and we cannot have a balance between humans and nature. This is a fundamental reason why the COVID-19 pandemic occurs. Second, the crisis shock of COVID-19 provides a momentum for change. Before the COVID-19, it would be very hard if we want to change people's value and lifestyle, but after COVID-19, we can say that the paradigm shift of development is possible. The pandemic is like a big test. Suddenly, everything is changed. Green transition is not just to produce the same stuff in a green way, but to change what we consume. We need to fundamentally rethink the so-called modern lifestyle and its underlying value system. After the pandemic, many people may have different answers to what is really important to our life. Many things we thought important are actually not, while many we didn't think important are actually very important. This has enormous implications to our green recovery. We value different things and then produce and consume different things, and doing things in a different way. It will change the course of economic growth. So the green could become a source of growth rather than a burden of growth. Green growth means that we can still have high growth, but with different content of growth, more dematerialized, more service-based. By the way, when we talk about the green recovery, it is not very accurate, in my view, since we are actually rebuilding better. This is a paradigm shift for development with new concept and new resources, new business model, new policies. In 2020, China didn't set GDP growth rate target for the first time. I think this is good for green transition, since if we set a GDP growth rate, then the local governments will try to reach GDP growth rate and don't take risk to translate to green economy. At this stage, China is making its 14th five-year plan. The spending after COVID-19 will be prioritized on green economy, including renewable energy, electric vehicle and recharging stations, environmental protection, ecological restoration, internet infrastructure, 5G, digital economy, green building, green urbanization, high-speed railway, green agriculture, etc. So it's pretty much like the European Green Deal, that we will never come back to the past after COVID-19. We're rebuilding a new one. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you very much, Yongzhen. And I think so far we've had surprisingly optimistic and forward-looking. And move next to Mary Nichols, who's chair of the Air Resources Board in California, where we've all seen and felt for the people of California facing these horrendous fires, Mary. So very pleased that you can be with us today, and very interested to hear from California about what's happening there and whether we can continue a note of optimism.
Well, good morning, Jill. And I have to say that last year at about this time, I believe you and I were hanging out in New York at the New York Climate Week. And I guess this still is officially New York Climate Week, but none of us are in New York as far as I know. It's great that we're able to talk and to share information. So, of course, the effects of climate change, which we are seeing and feeling and breathing here, are discouraging for those of us who've been working in this field for a number of years. It's also not very gratifying to be able to say, I told you so. On the other hand, the increased public awareness and focus on the need for strong climate action is encouraging, particularly when you understand, again, as we've been saying for quite some time now, that climate change is not only real, but it's here. And we can no longer make the artificial distinction between mitigation and adaptation, that everything we do has to take the reality of the need to adapt in mind without interpreting that as meaning throw up your hands and say there's nothing to be done, or, you know, prepare to move somewhere else. In fact, I think the opportunity, and it is an opportunity, to rebuild in the wake of the COVID pandemic is one that we need to seize on, and that fortunately a great many people now from the private sector as well as the public sector and the advocacy community recognize as a necessity. So from the car perspective, our most important initiative, and there are others out there, but in terms of the what the green recovery will call for, since transportation is half of our emissions inventory and at least half of our area of where we need to make changes. Um, this is the time for CARB to be able to move forward in a much more ambitious way that we've been able to before on the electrification of the transportation system. And of course, it's not just my agency, but all of state government, from the governor's office out into the transportation communities, and our many leaders at the local level also that have come to recognize that we've got to use the infrastructure as the tool for driving economic growth, cutting air pollution, which remains a health problem, which we now know is linked to the worst effects of COVID in the communities, and GHGs as well. So this is not just a climate program, but it is a climate program. It's also a health and economic development program. In 2018, the electric vehicle industry provided almost 300,000 jobs in California, which is really quite astounding because that was up from essentially zero 5 years before. There are huge economic growth and job potential opportunities that are connected to scaling up the zero emission vehicle infrastructure, not just for passenger cars, but across the medium and heavy duty sectors, commercial vehicles, transport of large containers from our harbors inland and up and down the state. Uh, these are jobs not just in putting in charging stations or improving roadways, but also actual manufacturing of vehicles and servicing of new technology vehicles as well. There are cost savings available as a result of operation in the electrification area that in turn will put money back into household budgets and into businesses as well, and that could be used by consumers for all kinds of other items, including necessities such as healthcare and other services, because of the lower maintenance and operating costs of zero emission vehicles, which are already apparent. We're seeing fuel savings, and this is a wonderful observation because it means that um, once the new vehicles achieve price parity, which they will within the next 5 years, based on the predictions that we've seen, we really have a win-win opportunity here. In addition, of course, since air quality continues to be a burden on our communities and one that is distributed very inequitably, I guess would be the right word. The opportunity to reduce medical expenses and improve longevity and quality of life for people in some of our poorest communities, most disadvantaged communities is really brings the social equity issue to the fore and provides a political impetus for legislators, decision makers to get behind this change. So, given the fact that disadvantaged households in disadvantaged communities spend about twice as much of their income on gasoline, which is needed in many instances just for people to get to work. The opportunity to help to eliminate some of that added burden is one that's an exciting thing to look at coming out of the COVID crisis as well. So basically the bottom line is public spending is going to be required. It looks as though we have a consensus that it should go in the direction. And this is not just state funds, because the state can't do this all by itself. It's going to require federal support as well. But a combination of subsidies and regulatory incentives, I think, will really help to move us in the direction of a turnover of our fleet in the time frame that we hope can get us away towards where we need to go towards our carbon neutrality goal.
Thank you very much, Mary. Last but not least, Dr. Amelie Amin, who's had a career working in government, in NGOs, in the Inter-American Development Bank, and currently in CDC. And I think, Amelie, you may need to explain what CDC is, but you can give a perspective from the rest of the world outside of the big economic areas of China, the EU, and the US.
Thank you, and thanks, Jill, and everyone for the invitation. It's a big responsibility to be speaking on behalf of the rest of the world, but I'll do my best. So CDC, well, CDC Group, as we are, with the UK's Development Finance Institute. We work only in Africa and South Asia, and we do private sector investments. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we're approaching this issue of a Build Back Better agenda, which will also focus heavily on the role of the private sector. But before I do, I thought maybe it's worth touching a little bit on what I see as the sort of public sector interventions that are going to be required, drawing a little more on my experience at the Inter-American Development Bank, because I think the multilateral development banks are going to be really critical in if the developing world is to be able to be part of a global green new Build Back Better agenda, and they don't get left behind, even further behind where they are. And so I think, as many have said, and certainly it's great to see what's happening in Europe, in China, in California, how the role of public stimulus as countries and states look to come out of the crisis that the pandemic has the economic crisis that the pandemic has created, in a way that can address also the climate crisis. So in many developing countries, of course, they are particularly constrained in terms of fiscal budget and space, and heavily burdened already with debt way before going into this pandemic. So a key element will be how the global public finance response can enable them to come out of this crisis in a way that is consistent with putting and really sort of pivoting their economies into the net zero pathways that they will need to be moving towards, as well as ensuring resiliency. I think as resiliency has become obviously an extremely important word in light of the COVID pandemic, but also looking at any other external shocks, which we know obviously climate change is already having around the world, in all countries, different impacts. And so resiliency also needs to be at the heart of this public agenda to build back better. And so in many countries, I would say, certainly my experience in Latin America, working at the Inter-American Development Bank, you know, we'd already started before I left, which was in February, just before the crisis happened. We'd started to work with many governments, ministries of finance in particular, around the types of green fiscal measures that would be needed to integrate and put their economies and their own national economic plans, investment strategies, critically strategies around infrastructure investments, to ensure that those were more consistent with a greener growth agenda or alignment with the Paris Agreement in terms of thinking about financial flows and alignment of those towards low carbon and resilient development pathways. So a lot of that work was already underway. Of course, ministers of finance around the world have all been rather preoccupied with responding to this very immediate, crisis that posed by the pandemic, in particular putting in place social safety nets to be able to manage the immediate response. But I think as hopefully we'll see, moving out now of that immediate response phase, that's where the multilateral development banks, and also I think further discussions around debt restructuring that will likely be convened by the IMF, as we saw earlier this year in April, looking at whether it's debt relief or debt restructuring. It's going to be really, really important that all of those measures are putting in place the institutional context, policies, regulations, all of those incentives to attract finance, particularly private finance, into the types of investments and technologies that everyone has just been talking about, whether that's for decarbonising the electricity sector, looking at mobility, electromobility, what is the scope to sort of leapfrog into that. But of course, recognizing that in many developing countries, they don't necessarily even have full electrification. So, some of these leapfrog opportunities may be extremely challenging, if not impossible, in this initial phase. But how to really create the basis and the pathway to be consistent with that. And that's where the public response measure is going to be critical. I'll just say very briefly a little bit about the CDC and how we've responded. So we've been working with our investees. So the investees that we're already part of our portfolio, to enable them to be, to help preserve them to get through this crisis. And a big part of that, I think, is very much linked to their ability to maintain workers and look at how to be able to provide those necessary, put in place the necessary measures to be able to continue with their businesses in this sort of crisis phase. But we're now looking increasingly to this next phase of both strengthening and then rebuild. And it's there that we very much see that our new climate strategy actually already provides the guidelines, if you like, for how we can build that better. We've set out a strategy which has 3 building blocks: one, to be net zero by 2050. The second is focused on adaptation and resilience, which is very challenging from the private sector perspective, but we see that's a really critical area. And the third, we've focused on this issue of just transition. And so, I think this issue of the just transition for workers and communities becomes even more relevant in light of the measures that are going to be taken now with COVID, because we will see, without a doubt, in all countries around the world, that some forms of employment just won't be viable. And certainly, I think one of the worries we have in our markets and looking at the developing world in particular is all these informal workers, the workers that are in that sort of informal sectors, and how can we really enable them to be able to get back to some form of employment that is going to be consistent with a greener growth or build that better agenda. I'm not going to say much about it now, but I do think there's a particular role for nature-based solutions in that context, which can, if done well, and I know the US actually has a lot of historical experience of that, you know, it can provide really, you know, jobs for the less skilled workers. And, you know, how do we really, you know, harness those opportunities so that we can, you know, build that better whilst bringing jobs to those informal sectors?
Thank you very much, Amelie. We have just 10 minutes and we have lots and lots of questions. So I'm going to throw a few of them out there and you can pick and choose. But people have been really interested in how they, as individuals, can support buy green bonds or support sustainable investment. That's one. People are quite interested in knowing what the impact of going to new forms of transport can have, and you know what I suppose perhaps maybe some of the differences between hydrogen and electric vehicles and what sort of impact that can have, and also on the, you know, the elevator pitch on the economic argument for going green, for rebuilding better. And I know both Arthur and Yongsheng touched on that in particular. So I'm going to start from the top, going back to Arthur. The three questions we've got is one about investing in sustainability, one about transport particularly, and the other one about the best elevator pitch economic argument for Build Back Better. And I'll do you in the I'll go through in the order in which you spoke. So Arthur first, and we only have a few minutes, so briefly, please.
Yes, let me just pick the one on sustainable finance, because that is really a crucial issue. And Amelie was introducing that. And that's also where in Europe we are taking regulatory action, because the first thing is to know what are we talking about when we talk about green investment. So we need a taxonomy to say what belongs into the basket and what doesn't belong into the basket. And that is something that is being created at the present point in time. And the interesting thing is that we see a lot of interest, not only in the European finance sector, but from all around the world. The banks are coming to us. We have a very vivid dialogue with the Bank of China on this, on how we can prepare the new standard when it comes to green finance. The second thing, of course, is that we also need to walk the talk. So when we talk about a recovery program for Europe, it has been made clear that about 1/3 of this is going to be financed with green bonds. So we talk here about an amount of 220+ billion euros that is going to be mobilized in the coming weeks and in the coming months. This practically is a steep increase in the global green bond market. So in that way, we also create new supply for that green bond market. And we hope that particular ordinary citizens who want to save some money, put it on the side, that they will look into buying green bonds. And in that way, they can all contribute to a green recovery in the coming years.
Thank you. And we've had another question thrown into the mix here. So Yongsheng, the questions are about transport, how that can change, about the economic argument, the elevator pitch on why Building Back Better is a good thing to do. The sustainable bonds issue that Arthur has just addressed, and the other one that is obviously we're getting quite a few questions about now, and I think has been touched on by many, is about those communities that are either particularly impacted by pollution and air quality, or by the transition away from fossil fuel industries, and how the recovery spend can help those communities. So you have a choice, one of those. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jill. I think I can use it, because you know, a couple of days ago, China and the EU and Germany have had a leaders meeting. So I may take this opportunity to say something about it. Yeah, about the green transformation. Because you know, at the meeting, China indicated and they discussed the green China EU green partnership. I think China is very serious to carbon neutrality and green transformation. Yeah. First, that China is very motivated and is very determined to go in green, although that existing growth model is unsustainable and the green transition is in China's own interest. We do green transition is not because of the international pressure, but in our own interest. No matter if other countries take climate action, China is determined to take strong action. Now, green development has become China's national development strategy, and the concept of ecological civilization was introduced into its constitution. Second, the carbon neutrality is a long-term target. China will be more active on peaking its emissions and on carbon neutrality when reviewing its nationally determined contributions. For instance, China is working with the EU to finalizing the implementations of the Paris Agreement guidelines in view of Glasgow. China is studying its own mid-century long-term strategy, including carbon neutrality. But we need to keep in mind that China is a huge country. Is a workshop is a developing country. It will be very difficult to confirm a time for achieving net zero emissions for a country as a whole. But for many Chinese cities and regions, I'm sure that they can achieve this target earlier. You know, many cities and the provinces in China are even bigger than many countries. So that for net zero emissions, I would like to say something. If a country claims that it has achieved net zero emissions, I'm not sure if it is still the case if taking into account its embedded emissions of imported products from developing countries. It is relatively easy if you use electric vehicle and solar panels to achieve net zero emissions in a city. But after all, some other countries, for instance, China, need to produce vehicle and solar panels with carbon emissions. Therefore, if country one is zero emission, country two is positive emission, it does not necessarily mean country one is doing a better job than country two. Please keep PC. Yeah,
Thank you. You raise a very interesting point there, Zhongzheng. Mary, we've had questions about a fair transition and the impact on low-income communities in particular, the elevator pitch, the impact of changes in transport, and how to invest. So pick one of those as your.
I think they're connected with each other because the argument that's frankly been made mostly by groups that have been put forward by the incumbent oil interests in California that EVs are only for rich people has a certain sway, and the idea that we would be giving subsidies to rich people to buy fancy cars doesn't go down well with the legislature and isn't something that is sustainable in any event over the long term. A couple of things to say. First of all, building back better doesn't just mean individual transportation. It also means the transit systems that are essential for many people in our communities and that we would like to be using more. And so in California, we are on a trajectory to move all buses to being zero emission, either battery or fuel cell, within the next 10 years. And that's going to be a huge undertaking. But of course, it would be a terrible waste if then nobody was getting on those buses. And right now, because of concerns about COVID, even though there's been adaptation done to make getting on and off buses safer, many people just don't want to do it. So we've got to grapple with a terrible state of our transit systems that need ridership and in any event have been chronically underfunded. One piece of that, and it was mentioned in one of the questions that I saw, is solving the problem of getting people to and from the transit system. And that can include scooters and bicycles. Electric bicycles are also an attractive option for many users, and they need to be a factor in our planning for mobility of the future. So without taking too much more time, I would just say that really re-envisioning transportation more broadly and to include multimodal active transportation as well as vehicles, and looking both at the light duty passenger and the heavier duty commercial vehicles is part of the whole pattern of what we need to be doing with the Build Back Better program. Why we need to do it? Well, we've got to do something to get people to work, to get businesses to be able to reopen or start, and transportation is key to that. So that and its relationship to housing as well makes it the really prime area, I think, to be focusing our attention on right now.
Indeed, the moment to reimagine transport. Amelie, we have just a minute for your comments, but please, we'd love to hear them. Thanks.
So yeah, I think really fully agree with everything that's just been said, and also really welcome the the EU's taxonomy on sustainable finance, because I think that's going to be essential to provide greater clarity and signals to investors. If we can have some sort of harmonized global approach towards what we mean by sustainable finance, that would be very welcome. Just briefly on this issue of leaving, how to avoid leaving workers behind. It's, we're very focused on this. One of our key parts of our mandate as a DFI is job creation. So we're very much focused on how we can also ensure that as we invest, we can also provide the skills and training that is going to be needed to go alongside the low carbon economy. But of course, there will still be a need to work with those communities to move them into different types of economic activity, which is not necessarily something we as an investor would do, but absolutely has to be an essential part of a global agenda. And I think, the EU's, didn't hear much about the EU's Just Transition Fund, but I think that could also be an interesting model potentially to look at in a more global context.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists, Zata Runga-Metzger, who's Director of Climate Action in the European Commission, Mary Nichols, who's Chair of the Californian Air Resources Board, Dr. Zhongzhen Zhang from the Chinese Institute for Social Sciences, Dr. Amelie Amin from CDC. The big takeaway for me that actually quite an optimistic discussion, but there are things that this crisis, we need to reimagine transportation, particularly mass transportation. We need to really, this is a confluence of moments to make sure that we understand what sustainable investment is, and the general public know what sustainable investment is and can confidently help us with that transition, to make sure that we don't leave communities behind and that there are jobs and opportunities out there, and we just need to grab these right now. I'm going to hand back to Nat Keohane.
Well, thanks, Jill, and thanks to our great panelists and to Jochen Fosbarth, of course. I take one thing away, which is what Mary said. It's all connected, and we need to do all of this and think about the connections among them if we're going to rebuild better and get the world back on track. Thank you to the audience for joining us. If you want to see more about what we're doing during Climate Week, please check out edf.org/climate-week. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Stay safe and be well.